Hello and welcome to the Gothic Colour channel. This is an introduction to my Kitten Prance design with information on how you can use it to make your own skirt. First of all, a few words on the pattern and the design. The pattern is a printout for a half-circle skirt with yoke. It can be adjusted to fit someone with a maximum waist of about 90 centimeters, that's 35.5 inches, and hips of 114 centimeters, that's 45 inches, all the way down to a child measurement. The smaller the circumference of the hips, the longer the skirt can be made. At the maximum size of hips, the skirt would be about 38 centimeters or 15 inches long from waist to hem, so a mini skirt. If you were to make this skirt for a small child, it could reach floor length, though you can easily make it shorter if you wish to. The Kitten Prance design used in this video comes in 8 color variations and makes a cute novelty skirt with a hint of folk inspiration. The pattern is available on 2 of my shops, on spoonflower.com and fashionformula.com, and I have links to these designs in the description box of this video. Also, as this video is quite a lengthy one by YouTube standards, I have included in the description box links to the different sections of the video so you can easily skip to the section you are most interested in. As the colors of the printed design can look different to what is seen on screen, let me first show you the samplers of the different colors that I got from my 2 shops. So, on the right, you can see the samplers from Spoonflower, and on the left are those from Fashion Formula. Just a note here, I ordered the samplers from Spoonflower in a format that allowed me to see the overall pattern of the skirt, so the sampler pieces are not of the same position of the pattern like you can see on the Fashion Formula samplers, however, you can still see the colors clearly. First we have the design in monochrome, a reddish black and grey variant. The printout from the 2 shops are near identical as you can see. Next, we have the chocolate brown and pale jade variant. Here, there is a slight difference. The colors are warmer on the Fashion Formula sampler, while the green on the Spoonflower sampler is more saturated. Next is the burgundy and deep red variant. The colors of the Fashion Formula sampler are richer. The sampler from Spoonflower has some striations which suggests that the printer was having problems at the time of printing. As it was just a sampler, I didn't ask for a reprint, but knowing the colors of Spoonflower prints I got in the past, I can tell you that the reds you can see here are fairly accurate to what you would get from them. Next, we have the royal blue and ice blue variant. The colors of the Fashion Formula sampler are richer, while the colors on the Spoonflower one look a bit more like denim, so a matter of preference as to which you would prefer. Next, we have the stone grey and sky blue. The Spoonflower sampler is a little bit darker, but other than that they are very similar. Then we have the lilac and baby pink variant. Again, the Spoonflower sampler is slightly darker and warmer in color than the Fashion Formula one. Next, we have the dark egg green and dusky pink variant. I ordered for a reprint for this, as I made a modification, that is why this is a different clip. The Spoonflower one is slightly darker, the Fashion Formula more pastel. Finally, we have the cream and lavender variant. Here, the cream color is slightly darker on the Fashion Formula sampler, while the lavender color is cooler than on the Spoonflower one. Now, let me show you how the pattern appears on the Fashion Formula website. The colors look quite dark on screen. The design is not meant to be that dark, but the actual printed samplers I received from them matched beautifully to my original files. I have uploaded photos of the samplers for each color variant, which I adjusted to match as closely as I could to the genuine colors of the prints. If the exact shade of the color is important to you, then it is a good idea to order a sampler on your preferred fabric. The price is pretty low. Now, If you are interested in ordering one of the patterns from one of my shops, I just want to bring to your attention two things. Firstly, the pattern is meant to be printed on 1 meter of fabric, and secondly, that the fabric needs to have a minimum of printable width of 140 centimeters, that's 55¼ inches. Fashion Formula has meters as a standard measurement, so you just need to pick this, and the width of the fabric can be seen next to the title of each type of fabric. If you were to order from Spoonflower, you can change the amount of fabric here, and you can find the width of each fabric under the title of each. So let me pick Dogwood Denim that has a width of 142 centimeters. Now you can see the whole design appearing on the preview. If the fabric measurements have come up on your computer as inches and yards, you can change this here, where you can also change the country and currency if these have come up wrong. Down here, you will see you can get the option between yards and meters. Let me show you what will happen if you buy the pattern as a yard. Right, so here you can see part of the yoke is cut off and the top section of the skirt is cut off, which means you will not get a proper half circle skirt. So if the measurements on this website have automatically come up on your computer as yards, you can easily change them to meters here, and then of course you can also change them back to yards afterwards if you want that as your default. By the way, you can see in this blue box it says I recommend a fabric wider than 147 centimeters. That is because I put the lightweight cotton twill as a good option to use for this pattern, and this twill is 147 centimeters wide. But actually the pattern is only about 140 centimeters wide, so it can be printed on fabrics that are narrower than what it says here. If you need a reminder for the minimum width, you can find this information if you scroll down and click on More under the About the Design section. Right, so now we start with the construction of the skirt. I am using the royal blue and ice blue variant of the design printed on denim. I am making it with a visible zipper, which I am going to have as a feature, and I am making it at around about the maximum size that this pattern allows. So based on what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is going to be a miniskirt. For this size, you will need a zip of about 23 centimeters or 9 inches. Before you even cut your fabric, the first thing to do is wash, dry and iron it using the standard directions for fabrics of the type you chose. This will allow the fabric to shrink to its proper size. This is very important, as if you cut and sew up the fabric as bought, then after you wash it for the first time, you may find yourself with a shrunk skirt that doesn't fit. I have already done that, so the fabric is ready for cutting. Here you can see me finding the markings of the seam allowance on the half circle and marking them for future reference. This will help me find the point where I'll need to match the pattern. I am doing this with pins, but you can use chalk or any fabric marker you trust won't leave a permanent mark on the fabric. Next, I cut the half circle skirt. No need to be too precise with the cutting at this point, as long as you don't cut into the coloured areas. I purposefully left a bit of the white area within the cut because the denim frays a bit. I cut also some of the excess white area around the top of the half circle. Next, you need to let the fabric stretch on the bias. I pinned mine on my dressmaker's dummy and left it for a couple of days while I dealt with the yoke. The reason for letting the fabric stretch before sewing is that to make sure the design of the kittens remains parallel to the hem, we have to cut the excess fabric from the top, or the center if you like, of the skirt. I'll show you how to do that later on in the video. So next, I cut the yoke pieces. I cut them with a fair amount of the white area around them because I made this skirt, as I mentioned, roughly at its maximum size, so for what I'm doing I wanted to make sure that I didn't accidentally cut off too much fabric. Like with a half circle, you will see some markings on some of the yoke pieces. I left enough excess fabric around the pieces so the markings would still be visible when I needed them later on. These markings help with the positioning of the design when the skirt is assembled. There are 6 pieces for the yoke. 3 make the external part and 3 the lining. It is up to you whether you want to use the lining part or if you wish to use a different type of fabric or not have a lining at all. As the denim fabric I was using was quite thick, I did not need to use any interfacing. The 2 layers of denim for the yoke gave it enough structural strength. So let me just show you how you can get a template for your yoke. If you already have a pattern for a yoke that works for you, then by all means use it and skip this bit of the video. I have here a piece of scrap woven fabric cut along the grain to avoid stretching, which is wide enough to go around my hips. You can also use dressmaker's paper if you have any. The yoke of this skirt is meant to be 12 centimeters, that is 4 3/4 inches high. Though in this video I made it about 14 centimeters, that's 5.5 inches, testing it to its limit. What you do is up to you. Wrap the fabric around your hips, making it into a tube using the maximum of your hip circumference. Try to make sure the fabric is not sitting on a slant. Flatten out the front and back and pinch the sides to size, but avoid overstretching the fabric. Pin the sides into position. You might need to move the pins a few times to adjust properly. Using a mirror, try to put the pins in the middle between back and front and put more pins to create a straight line down following the curves of your hips. You can also add darts if you need more shaping. Then use a marker to draw the lines along the pins, as close as you can to the pins, at the opening of the fabric so you can remove it. Also, mark the top of the yoke, around about the belly button area, and the bottom of the yoke 12 centimeters down. Mark also the center back where your spine is. You can always look sideways in a mirror to get a reasonable parallel point to the front. Once you have removed the fabric, you can add any more markings as you need or adjust your markings to make them more even. Here you can see the adjustments I am making on a yoke template I made earlier since I am not making this skirt for myself. I folded the front and back in half to cut the pattern symmetrically. You'll see I have some tiny darts on the template. I ended up not really taking them into consideration as I was able to adjust the shape from the sides when I did the lining. Once you are done adjusting, you can cut the fabric at your markings into 3 pieces, 2 at the back and 1 at the front. This will give you the first rough template for your yoke. Use this template to deal with your lining first. Your template does not have any seam allowance, so you need to add it before cutting the fabric of the lining. I cut approximately 1.5 to 2 centimeters away from my tracing to allow for the seam allowance. I basted the lining pieces together, you can pin them together if you prefer, and tucked in the seam allowances. Then it's time for a quick fitting. I am pinning where the yoke lining needs adjustments, and after marking any adjustments that needed to be made, I detached the lining pieces from each other and pinned in the seam allowance of each piece according to the changes I made. I then used the lining pieces to trace the shape on the exterior pieces. Don't forget, where your lining will be facing inwards, the exterior pieces will be facing outwards. Starting with the front panel, you will need to make sure you take into account the center of the pattern. The front piece has markings top and bottom that indicate the center. Here I am folding my exterior front panel in half to make it easier to see where to position the lining. Because the fabric I am using is 100% cotton, the fold stays nicely. If you choose a fabric that doesn't keep a fold easily, you may need to either press it or just mark it with a fabric marker. Here I am checking to see the vertical positioning of the pattern. The fabric I am using is quite thick, however I can still see the pattern at the back, so I don't need to make my tracing on the front. Once I decided on the positioning, I traced my pattern as I did with the lining, again tracing where the seams will have to be, and cutting a generous seam allowance in addition to that. If you use a thick fabric, like I'm doing, make sure you add a fair few extra millimeters to your tracing to allow for the outer fabric to lie comfortably on top of the lining fabric. You will have noticed that I tend to trace where the seams will need to be sewn, and I just cut further out to allow for the seam allowance. I know that dressmakers tend to trace at the edge of the seam allowance and then just sew parallel to that, but I do not really trust myself to do that. I work on surface pattern design while sewing is more of a hobby of mine. If you do things differently than what you see in this video, then by all means do what you know best. The back panels have markings to indicate where the seam allowance needs to be folded so that the designs on the two panels match. This is quite important if you are going to use an invisible zip. I am using a zip that I want to make a feature, so it will be very visible. However, I am still taking these markings as my seam point. To make sure that the design sits at about the same height at the back as at the front, I took a common point of the design on the front panel and measured it to where the bottom seam will be. Then I did the same thing on the back panel and marked it. Once I traced the outline of the lining onto the exterior panel, I folded the second back panel of the yoke, where the zip was going to go, and compared it to the first piece. I folded in the top and bottom of the seam allowance so I could clearly see where I needed to position the seams on the second panel. I could then trace the lining onto the second back panel in the correct position. However, as I was planning to have the zip partially exposed, I needed to take the extra width into consideration. So I was planning to have about 1 centimeter of the zip visible, so I needed to take half a centimeter off each of the back panels. For the lining, it didn't matter, as I could move the zip seams accordingly, but the exterior of the yoke needed more careful adjustment so that the design sat as I wanted it to. In this case, I marked half a centimeter out from where the seam allowance fold is meant to be, in the middle where the zip was going to be placed. I then traced the lining from that point to the sides, basically making the back panels narrower by half a centimeter. Once all that was sorted, I could sew up the sides of the yoke, both of the lining and the exterior. This is a good point for another fitting to check whether the lining and exterior sit nicely on top of each other and that the seams match up. Next for some maths. As the yoke sits a bit higher up from the widest part of the hips, we need to take a final measurement. I used the exterior of the yoke and measured at the seam tracing at the bottom of the yoke, making sure I was not including the seam allowance. I jotted the number down, and because I'm paranoid, I took the measurement again to double check. I used this number as the circumference, C. I did the following calculation to find out the diameter, D. As this is a half circle skirt, I needed to double the diameter. In order to keep the position of the design parallel to the hem, I needed to measure the skirt from the hem upwards, so I could cut off any excess fabric caused by the bias stretching from the central circumference. So what I needed is the final length of the half circle skirt without the yoke from hip down. To do that, I needed just a bit more math. The diameter of the hem for this pattern is approximately 130 centimeters, that's 51¼ inches, though that can change a little if the fabric shrunk quite a bit during washing. If you use the fabric that shrunk a lot, you can measure the diameter across from hem to hem. Otherwise, the approximation of 130 centimeters should do. So, taking the doubled diameter from 130, or 51¼ if you're using inches, and dividing the result by 2, this gives us the length of the skirt before hemming. Then, adding to the result 2½ centimeters, 1 inch, that is 1½ centimeters for the seam allowance, plus another centimeter to allow for any stretching caused by the areas that are cut on the bias. We can always cut off a bit more if we need to later on. As the fabric of the skirt had stretched at different rates at different points, I found that the easiest way to take this measurement was by starting at the edges and folding the skirt in half as I went along, always measuring from the hem of the side that I was marking. Once I had enough marks, I joined them together using straight lines to start with to form a polygon. At this point, it was relatively easy to cut off the excess fabric before fine-tuning my markings to make the cut into a proper half circle. Once I sorted out all the cutting and removed any remaining white areas of the fabric around the edges, I started overlocking the edges to stop the denim from fraying too much. Next starts the assembly of the skirt. First I joined the exterior of the yoke to the skirt. I basted it first to make sure it all fitted properly. Here I'm showing you the basting I did at the back of the skirt to match the pattern. From here you can go straight into sewing it up, leaving space for your zip. However, I decided to give the skirt a little bit of extra length using strips of fabric from the area that was cut off at the center of the skirt. I cut these strips uniformly and then pinned them to the hem of the skirt in order to find out the angle I needed to join them. I pinned them the wrong way up with some overlapping so I could easily mark where to join them. Once I had all the markings, I removed the strips and sewed them together to form an angular ribbon, which I then sewed onto the hem and created a neat edge. Anyway, you do not need to do this, you can just fold the fabric and sew up a normal hem. I then moved on to the zip of the skirt. I pinned around the zip, making sure it was in the position that I wanted, and making sure that the pattern and yoke seams matched across. Also, I made sure that the seam allowances at the yoke and skirt seam were lying flat into the yoke, so that they could be covered by the lining once I put it into position. So I continued pinning and checking the position of the zip until I was satisfied, and then I sewed the zip into position on the seam allowances. At this stage I did not sew close to the zip as I wanted to top stitch everything into position once I had the lining of the yoke sorted. Next, I pinned the lining onto the yoke, making sure that all seam allowances were lying flat into the yoke. I had iron pressed the seam allowances into position before pinning to make sure everything was folded neatly, and made sure the lining side seams matched to the side seams of the exterior of the yoke, as well as that the ends of the yoke round the back matched at the zip position. I turned the skirt the right way out and checked how the lining was sitting against the exterior of the yoke. I then basted the yoke, did another fitting, made some little adjustments, and then the yoke was ready for top stitching. As my fabric was quite thick, I basted the yoke really thoroughly to prevent the layers from slipping around while sewing on the sewing machine. Since I do not have a double needle, and because I wanted to give the skirt a proper denim look, I top stitched it twice at an even distance. I did some trials on a scrap piece of the denim to find the positioning I wanted, as well as to check the tension and length I needed for the stitch. After top stitching, I removed the basting thread, gave the skirt a wash, dried it, ironed it, and the skirt was ready. You can easily modify the sewing of this pattern to really personalize it, so if you decide to make one for yourself, do send me pictures of what you made and I'll pin them on my Pinterest account. I am currently working on the same pattern of skirt, but with a different design printed on it that I called marmoration. I am making this with a thinner fabric, so I am using interfacing in the yoke, I am making a lining for the skirt, and I'm using an invisible zip. I am hoping I'll have the video out in a few weeks' time. If you're interested in watching that, then do subscribe and click on notifications so you get notified of my next upload. Goodbye!